So I first just wanted to say thank you to several people. Thank you to Dennis DeHart for the invitation and all of the organizational aspects of putting this visit together. I want to thank Department Chair Tom Brown and all of the other faculty, staff, and students that support the Visiting Artist Program at Washington State University. And I especially want to thank David Herbold and the 8 graduate students that I met with today. David for suggesting me for the program, and to the 8 students for just being so generous and sharing your ideas and your work with me today. It was really great to talk to all of you, so thank you so much. So I'm going to talk about my recent work. I'm going to start going back maybe 6 years or so, but then quickly talk mostly about the last 2 to 3 years. Just to give you a little bit of background and an introduction to my art practice. The work I have created over the last decade has expressed my curiosity about the natural world, and more specifically how ideas about animals, plants, and places are created in the larger visual culture. This examination of how nature is represented began with an investigation of various places and subjects, most specifically natural history displays, zoological parks, field guides, nature programs, and other places where animals appear to represent nature, yet have been mediated through a number of cultural systems. I observed that animals displayed and preserved through classifications and categories created for our own understanding became merely tropes of living and breathing beings. The counterpart to this interest is that I'm also involved in experiencing how time in the natural world and in wilderness.
It's the connection.
I think it just times out. I think it's just timing out. So once I get moving through, it'll be better. So spending time in the natural world and in wilderness, and in the direct observation of the natural world also is shaping the way in which my work is evolving, especially lately, and the way I consider pictorial representation of animals and landscapes. So just to give a little background, my educational background was primarily focused on painting and drawing and printmaking. And although I now work in a variety of media, the essential elements of drawing practice in particular still influence my work a great deal, and even when I'm working in other medias, I often consider what I'm doing as drawing. I often rely on visual devices that are often used in the drawing practice, repetition, mimicry. I often reference certain historical styles of drawing and printmaking to call attention to issues of representation. And I also utilize strategies, overlapping, shifting, and altered use of scale and the juxtaposition of images to encourage the viewer to reconsider their way of looking at the natural world. So the series that I thought I would start with is about 6 years old, but it's primarily involved in painting, and in a lot of ways talks to several interests that I have. So I did a series of paintings that were about extinct birds, and I was looking at the birds. Of course, in most cases, I was looking at other artists' representations of the birds. In some cases, I was able to look at photographs, but obviously the images are mediated through then other artists and other sort of historical things that are going on. So these are extinct birds on imitation gold leaf on wood panel. And also my interest in 18th and 19th century artists, naturalist ideas, and the work of people like John James Audubon, Mark Catesby, Anna Atkins is evident here. So I did the first painting that I was just showing was a dodo, and then I did a series of 3 other paintings of the ivory-billed woodpecker, the passenger pigeon, and the Carolina parakeet. The ivory-billed woodpecker, which is in this image, disappeared completely by the mid-20th century. It was thought to have been seen in 2005, but it was not confirmed, but it set off this, sort of frenzy among bird watchers and people in the swamps of Louisiana where this bird lived were looking for it, and people were just sort of desperately seeking to find this bird that was thought to be extinct. So I was very interested in that. And also, I was interested in representing this bird in particular because Audubon, in his time, had seen this bird and painted it. And he called it, this is just what I read in one of his journals, the Van Dyke bird. And he called it the Van Dyke bird because it reminded him of Anthony Van Dyke's paintings, the 17th century painter, who often had he thought that the palette that the bird had was like the palette. So here he was looking at this bird, thinking about, historically how it reminded him of a painter, and here I am, looking at these images and creating this painting. So I thought there was this interesting correlation, not only of the natural world, but also in painting. The other birds in the series were the passenger pigeon, and this image is taken from a famous photograph of the last surviving passenger pigeon, which was in the Cincinnati Zoo. Her name was Martha. She died 100 years ago this year, so it's a big year that people are sort of looking back at the passenger pigeon. And then this is the Carolina parakeet. This was the only parrot species native to the eastern United States. And these birds have become some of the most well-known of the extinct species of birds, due in part to their representation by artists.
Yeah, we lost it.
I'm going to have to be sure to keep cycling through. And the way I'm choosing to represent these with the mirror images conveys multiple ideas related to the longing to reproduce or reinvent lost species using poetic or scientific means. This was the first in a series of bodies of work that were exploring the idea of the doppelganger in the scientific sense of cloning, but also in the literary sense of the doppelganger foreshadowing some sort of usually bad event. And there was something about that dual image that gave me this interesting idea, and this idea of longing, longing because it's a couple, longing because it could be, the idea that we could clone something that becomes extinct in the future. And so that particular series led me to investigate this idea and my interest in, particularly in 19th century ornithological illustration, to create this series, which is called the Beautiful Series. I was originally came to the idea of making this image. I was invited by my friend Melanie Yazzie, who teaches at the University of Colorado at Boulder, to a print exchange. And the theme of the exchange was examining issues of beauty in the popular culture, particularly for women of color from a variety of different groups. And the organizer asked specifically for each artist to in some way talk about their own personal experience, but then also make a print that included something that was related to their usual work. Even if they didn't usually make work about issues of beauty, that they would include something about their own work. So this was really interesting to me as a challenge because it was something kind of outside my usual interest, but I was very interested as a woman, as a biracial individual who had dealt with issues of conforming to standards of beauty for women in the larger culture, and also to those within the African American and European American cultures, to which the two sides of my family come from. So this series of 6 images was created after the original print, and so I took the original image from the print and then made a series of 6 hand-colored. So these are polyester plate lithography, and then they're hand-colored with gouache. And by hand-coloring them and making it a series, I was able to kind of play with, they're supposed to be kind of humorous, playing with, changing up color, the kind of things that you would sort of fall into in the trappings of these, things and ideas of standards of beauty, and then of course the other trappings of like the accessories, like something like a purse. And so I created this image of a bird. It's a made-up, both of the birds are made up, and they sort of take on qualities of a variety of different species. And then particularly for myself in Issues of Beauty, the whole idea of hair came up. Because, I grew up with this head of hair that I have right now, and depending on where I lived and who was around, I was very comfortable either going between having an afro and ironing my hair super, super straight, and always trying to, fit this idea of what was appropriate and what was beautiful in terms of hair. So in these 2 pieces, we've got the blonde hair, the gray hair, and then the hot pink hair and the brown hair, and each one takes on a slightly different look just based on the color. Really kind of inspired by that particular series, I also did a series that sort of took the idea of standards of beauty, standards of what's interesting, culturally, and modification of the body in our culture, and also applied this to this drawing style of the 19th century. So I was fascinated with images of bats in early animal illustration because they were always depicted pinned, which of course is this really, really strange view. Like you would never actually see a bat all sort of laid out like this with his, business all up, in your face. And I thought, how funny would it be, if a bat, because of course the whole idea with the Beautiful series is like, how ridiculous would it be if a bird, this most beautiful thing, also wanted to like alter its appearance because of some sort of ridiculous standard of beauty. So, what if the bat, wanted to get this tattoo, and in this case it says P-I-M-P, and of course that combined with the pose, makes this sort of ridiculous combination. So, at about this time, a lot of my work started to vacillate a lot between really looking at a lot of these historical representations and starting to do a lot of work out in the field, where I was doing, these studies from, actual things that I was seeing, but also, making work that it was about my internal responses to things. So I did a series soon after the Beautiful series that was called the Double series. These are works on paper that use drawing and then the printmaking techniques of sheen collé. And also painting. And I also wanted to go back and explore this idea of the doppelganger and the genetic twin. So these images are created using drawing and printmaking to combine the mechanical and physical aspects of mark making. The juxtaposition of these techniques and images relate to what's culturally considered authentic or duplicitous, the former meaning genuine, real, not copied, and the latter meaning twofold or double and also deceitful. So just the whole idea of something that can be reproduced seemed like so differently charged than something that's considered original. So I thought it was interesting to think about these ideas in sort of a larger sense, but also think of them in terms of art making. As an artist and also as an identical twin, I'm very interested in the cultural and scientific discussion of how genetic and environmental factors shape our identities and our physical bodies. So I'm an identical twin, and my twin sister has multiple sclerosis, which is a disease that has a genetic component, but it also has a yet unknown other factor that causes it. So I don't have multiple sclerosis. We have the same genetic material. So this is one of the reasons I'm interested in like this idea of the same and then of the different, of the, you know, what can be identical, but what can also be different. And so that's really what this series was exploring in a lot of ways. So I was doing drawings, trying to duplicate various mark making and various drawings of particular objects by just drawing it twice. And of course it's impossible to draw something exactly the same twice, because there's always going to be like a shift of the hand, or you know, some other thing is going to happen. And of course, the other thing I was thinking about while making this series is, of course, since my identical twin has MS, every time I'm like drawing something really tightly or intricately and my hand kind of jerks or shifts, I wonder, like, is this the sign, you know, that I'm going to get sick? Or that I'm, you know, losing some of my fine motor skills. So also as an artist, just the whole idea that one could sort of lose these capabilities was also like really fascinating and something to explore. And then just the idea of, you know, the literary, you know, I was doing a lot of reading. This image is getting kind of washed out on this projector, but I was doing a lot of reading about the literary idea of the doppelganger as something that's like foreshadowing something that's bad, and what does it mean to be like, you know, literally a doppelganger because you're a twin. So I was kind of thinking about those ideas and creating these images, and thinking about what does it mean to repeat an image, you know, mechanically using something like a digital process or a printmaking process versus the hand process of drawing it. So in some cases I was doing like trace monograph, where you're really, trace monoprint, where you're actually using like a drawing process, but you're making a print, and then in some cases I was using a stencil or some other means of like exactly duplicating the dual images. So my interest in printmaking and making multiples, this is about, I don't know, 4 years ago, I became interested in the idea of making like many, many multiples of one particular form, in particular out of paper, really kind of pushing the idea of printmaking sort of out of the idea of making a print, but also out of the idea of just doing something two-dimensional, and what would happen if you made lots and lots of multiples of one form to create some other kind of image. So about that time I was invited to do an installation at the Friesen Galleries at Northwest Nazarene University, and they had, you know, a fairly large space that I could use and kind of explore. So I came up with the idea, a piece that's called Twice Migration, and this is 500 on this wall is 500 cut and folded paper birds. And what I did was I created a die. So this was, you know, sort of interesting in its relationship to like making a matrix for printmaking, in that I designed a die. The solid lines were a blade, and then the dotted lines were a blunt edge that would make a nice line to make a fold. And then I hand folded and glued each of the 500 birds and attached them to the wall to give the visual idea of a flock of birds in migration. So each one of the birds is exactly the same, but depending on how they're attached and the way the light is falling on them, it gives this sense of movement. And then I took another grouping of the birds and made, again through repetition, but just in this case through stacking and gluing, made this you know, column piece where it just goes from floor to ceiling. But they're all just glued, like using a similar, not unlike making a book, to make this taller sculptural piece. And it really took on the look of like a backbone, which is another interest of mine, is forms in the natural world, when repeated, when twisted, when abstracted, often mimic each other. And there's a lot of the same forms that you see over and over and over again. So that it was interesting to me, kind of inspired some later work that I'll talk about, that this form of a bird, when folded and stacked in a particular way, started to take on the look of like a vertebrae or some other natural form. And then there's a piece also in the shell that you can kind of see in the back there, the kind of off-white. So there was another piece with blackbirds, and then the piece in the background that looks sort of off-white was die-cut felt that was machine embroidered with a series of words taken from a 1923 book on migration. One of the early accurate descriptions of how bird migration takes place. So here's a detail of the book piece, and then here's a detail of one of those pieces. And depending on how you read through the piece, different, phrases would be spelled out, and it would say different things. And again, I was interested in this historical text kind of up until this point. There was a lot of really inaccurate and interesting and sometimes very poetic and unscientific descriptions of what migration is and why it happens and why it takes place. So I was very interested in that, and according to how you sort of read through this installation, some of what you were reading was accurate, some of what you're reading wasn't accurate. Doing this piece, I became very interested in the material of felt. One of my artistic heroes for quite a while has been Joseph Beuys, and of course I was familiar with his use of felt and his, how he sort of took meaning from that. And I did a series of three-dimensional felt objects in my studio that were different forms, either to be worn or simple kind of architectural type forms for different insects, animals, and plants. So they were for like small mammals, not plants, insects. So they were for small mammals, small amphibians, birds, and insects. So for instance, this, and I'll get to why they're on this bird's head in a second. Just a little background. So for instance, the piece in the corner that's totally obscuring the bird's face was actually something like a cat bed for a mouse. So like a fuzzy cat bed that's sort of like that tube kind of thing that the cat gets into. So I have a little toy poodle, and he's so small that he actually really likes cat beds because he likes the sort of tall sides. So I was imagining that, a little mouse might like a little bed like that. So the idea originally of the project would be that I would make these forms and then put them out, where they could potentially have interactions with these various creatures. Now, before I even got to that point, after I had made all the forms and sort of was looking at them in the studio, and sort of deciding exactly how we would go about taking on this other project, I had this chucker, this stuffed chucker, which is a partridge. It's not native to Idaho, but people raise them and release them for hunting, so they're found. And I had used it for an earlier project, so I had it in the studio, and I set one of the pieces up on top of its head. And of course, immediately it took on the form of a hat. So I started photographing each one of the pieces, even though they weren't made for this bird. but putting, you know, the particular size and scale that they ended up being, they each like oddly fit the bird's head because they were for much smaller animals. And of course they took on, you know, all these different associations. So one of them was made for a bird's head, and the one in the top corner that looks like sort of a chicken's comb. And I actually made that for one of my chickens because chickens' combs can freeze in the wintertime. And you're supposed to put Vaseline on them to keep them from freezing if it gets really, really cold. So I had the idea, like, what if I just made a nice cozy little hat for the chicken? And so that's one of the particular forms. So they were experimental hand-sewn garments and structures, but they took sort of a side trip as hats. The interesting thing was the photographs were not really intended to be part of my work. I'm not a photographer, and I didn't really think, it was just really like an investigational thing. Oddly, a couple years after I had made these, a curator, and this is how I met David Herbold, because he was also in this exhibition, a curator was putting together a show of unfinished projects by artists. And so the three curators came to my studio. I'm not really one to leave things unfinished, so I kind of was like, I'm not really probably have anything for the show, but I did have the felt pieces, and I hadn't, you know, finished the kind of initial project. But right as they were leaving the studio, they had looked at the felt projects, they were really interested in them, but then I just kind of offhandedly showed them the photographs. And they were, you know, very interested in the photographs. And so it turns out that they ended up putting them in the show. And of course, as soon as they were in a show, they like took on this life of their own as these, you know, headgear for birds, and people were interested in them, and they ultimately ended up in some other shows. So it really kind of altered the idea. But of course, the idea for me initially was that it was an investigation, so I thought, well, this is just part of the investigation. So that's kind of where this project lies. I'll just show you a few other pieces here. The other interesting thing is, I think in a photo like this, it's really obvious to me that this bird is not alive, but most people looking at the photographs thought the bird was alive. And of course, because of, you know, all the forms were not made particularly for this bird, all these other associations started coming up. So people would look at this one and they would say, like, oh, that bird is a prisoner, you know, or that bird is like, you know, going to be executed, you know. So the idea of the forms like taking on all these other meanings was really fascinating too. The felt, of course, felt is this insulating. The reason I selected it in the first place, it's insulating, it's absorbing. It's absorbing of sound, it's absorbing of liquid. It has this association with healing, which is one of the reasons why Boyce was interested in it. And so my initial idea with making these, you know, was really like this feeling like, oh, I really want to have this interaction, this, you know, comfortable, like wonderful sort of interaction that the animals will all be so grateful to me that I made these things. Of course, knowing in, you know, in real terms that they probably wouldn't care and they wouldn't use them because they have their own, you know, their own culture and their own way of doing things. But more to come on that project. There's still plans in the works to go ahead with documenting them all and the possible or maybe impossible interaction with the other creatures. In 2010, I was awarded a residency at Denali National Park and Preserve. And this is the cabin that one is housed in at Denali National Park and Reserve if you're a resident. It's called the East Fork Cabin, and it's a historic 14 by 16 cabin built in the 1920s. I was really interested in it because it's the site of Adolph Murray's landmark studies in the early 1940s of the relationship of wolf and Dall sheep in Denali National Park, and which was really on a larger scale about the predator-prey relationship. And his study is still cited, a lot today because it really was about the sort of larger issue of why we need large predators in the ecosystem. And so I was very fascinated to be able to spend time in this cabin and also spend time where, he was, this is really like his home base for this particular research. Now the cabin has no electricity, it has no running water, so back in the bushes up over there's a little outhouse. There's no cell phone connection in this area, so it's also really, an amazing experience just to kind of step off the grid. So this is a picture of Adolph Murray. Every time I look at him, he always looks extremely underdressed for winter conditions in Alaska, but he looks very stylish. So 1940, 1941, he did this study, and it was really, kind of old-fashioned field science. Like he was just out there counting wolves, monitoring what they were doing, looking at their kills. Pretty interesting. So, so this is a photograph that I took while I was there. Being in Denali, I had the experience of being very overwhelmed and in awe of the sheer scale of the landscape and of the large animals that live there. So, of course, living in Idaho, I'm used to big mountain vistas, but something about Alaska, and of course something about knowing that you're in a national park that's 6 million acres, just gives you this feeling of being extremely tiny. And knowing that there's bears and wolves around where you're sleeping, like every night, is scary. And this led me to concentrate on a lot of the creatures and plants of a more smaller scale, and ones that seem familiar due to their relatives being regularly found in urban and suburban backyard and gardens. So things like snowshoe hares, Arctic ground squirrels, and on the tundra itself, particularly around that area, there's lots of different fungi, lichen, moss, very abundant in that area. And just the tundra itself was like this amazing material, just walking on this ground that most of the year is frozen solid, but this time of year I was there in July, it was just like this soft, spongy, little tiny plant. It's almost like this blanket-like material. So since it's a one-room cabin, there's not a lot of space to actually make work while you're there. It's really just about being there and experiencing the place. And so I went back to my studio and really focused on these, in particular, the snowshoe hare. I was very fascinated by it because of its ability to change color from brown to white. And I decided I wanted to make a piece, a kind of more monumental piece that was about the snowshoe hare. So this was a big piece that I did. It's like 6 by 7 feet, and it's an imitation gold leaf rabbit. So the rabbit itself is about 6 feet tall, and then all of the linear elements that are around it are either drawn with graphite, colored pencil, or ink. And a lot of them are actually sewn and embroidered right into the surface. So the interesting thing about my experience in Alaska and how it really sort of played out in my work is I focused in a lot of ways on what's unseen. So in this image, the rabbit, of course, was what was seen, but all the linear elements in some cases take on like a sort of reference to something like a tree ring, to something like a topo map. But also the really interesting experience that I came out of this residency with was my sort of internal like changing of how I think my brain was functioning, because there was no electronics. Strangely, like that experience was, you know, really the most like impactful. Like my entire way of thinking about the world and sleeping and waking totally changed from not ever looking at any computer, television, any sort of, you know, having any sort of connection to the outside world, and totally like looking within and then looking out at the landscape. So that's really what I took away from this particular wilderness experience. So I put in this image just to kind of help show the scale. And you can see this is where I just started all the embroidery work. So all of those linear elements, and here's a detail, are sewn through the canvas with embroidery thread of various colors, but all sort of variations of white. The other thing that's going on in Alaska in July is that there's like 20 hours of daylight. So that kind of influenced the palette that I was using here. Everything is like off-white. You know, because there was this experience, like very strange experience of light. And then of course I was also, all the time when I was looking at these little furry animals, I couldn't help but to think about what they did in the wintertime and their winter experience, you know, being in the dark, 45 below. I kept imagining just this white, you know, frozen surface. The other series that I started when I got back was called News from the Wilderness, and it examines how animals are represented in the popular news media. Since I visited Denali, I've noticed, and I just have this heightened awareness of how a particular story and image was used again and again in stories about animal and human interactions, and specifically in bear attacks. And there was actually one particular image of a bear, this one, that every time there was, you know, in Yellowstone or Denali or wherever it was, where there was like a human and bear encounter, on the internet, on the television, they would use this image. And I was so fascinated by it because, of course, in the image, this bear is super aggressive, even though it's probably like a trained bear that makes this face for somebody to photograph. And if you Google bear face, like this comes up like 500 times before anything else. And so I was very fascinated about the story that's being told about grizzly bears. So this stock image of a very menacing bear was used, and a couple times, you know, regardless of the location and regardless to the bear species in question. So a couple times they were using this image when it was like a story about a black bear, or, you know, some other thing. So, so I was very interested in, you know, then looking back about the stories that are told about animals and how they're told in the popular news media and also in other places. The other fascinating thing about the Denali experience was that I also, you know, I obviously had, when I was there, I had a lot of time to do a lot of reading, and I did a lot of reading about the history of artists in national parks and the history of artists in residence programs in the national parks, but also just about, you know, famous and some not famous artists who made work in the national parks. And a lot of it is traditional, representational, like obviously a lot of paintings of landscapes over the years, and from very particular views. And one of the interesting experiences I had when I was there is Denali's 6 million acres, but there's only one road in the entire place, and it's 92 miles long, and you have to ride a bus to go through the park. You can't take a personal car except for under certain circumstances. So as the artist in residence, I could ride the bus anytime I wanted. I just had to go out and flag it down, and I could ride anywhere on the road. So when I was wanting to hike in different places, I would hop on. And of course, you know, the bus is mostly moving tourists. And so it would have these certain places that it would always stop. And where it would stop, everyone would file out, everyone would get out their camera, and they would take a picture, and 99% of the time, what they were trying to get a picture of was Mount Denali. which is, you know, the big mountain in the park. Mount Denali is almost always covered in clouds, so of course if it was a day where it happened to be, you know, not cloudy, like everyone was super excited. But of course all I could imagine myself was the thousands and millions of pictures that have all been taken from this exact same vantage point. And of course it's 6 million acres and you can go anywhere you want, but you have to go, you know, by foot or by plane or other means. So most people are just moving through the park on these buses. So I was also interested in making a piece that commented in some way on this. So this is a snapshot. The one clear day that the mountain, you know, the clouds sort of went away, I took this photograph of Mount Denali, and then I made this piece. It's called 13 Ways of Looking at Denali, and the title refers to the 1954 poem by Wallace Stevens called 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, which references, among many other things, the multiplicity of seeing and questioning one's own thoughts. So I used these snapshots, and then I overlaid the snapshots with string art. And before I did this project, string art was sort of known to me as like a fun craft of the 1970s. When I was growing up, you'd get like velvet and you'd make like a string art picture of like a ship or something like that. And that was really my only association with string art. But when I started to research the idea of string art, and I found out it was actually originally called curve stitching, and it was developed by a mathematician called Mary Everest Boole at the end of the 19th century, which I thought was really interesting because I was like, wow, you know, she was a female mathematician at the end of the 19th century, and she invented this technique to help explain mathematical theories to children. So essentially making a curved line from a straight line. And I'll show an example of that. This one doesn't show that, but I'll show you that in a second. So there's this really fascinating background to this, you know, this thing that I just thought of as this, you know, kind of goofy craft. And I thought, well, how interesting that you can use, you know, this thing that has traditions of, you know, craft to also talk about multiplicity and numbers and geometry. So this led to another series that I did. These are actually very small pieces, but they also, this one's called Glacier. Here's an example where it's showing this mathematical principle of using straight line segments to make a curve. So you can see, and the name Boole might be popping up in your mind. Mary Everett Boole's husband was Boole of Boolean geometry, which is kind of like, and that like curved line, I think it's called the Bezier curve. I'm not a mathematician, but it's sort of the basic for like vector graphics. So it's sort of the basis of like a lot of like digital imagery that we see now. So I was just so fascinated that this, you know, this technique that you know, seems so simple can be something so complicated. So this is a smaller series. So here is just using the curved line to mimic the curved line of the snake. This piece is kind of going back to the idea of the doppelganger. So I put the nails in the two identical birds, and then created my own string art pattern with variations that, you know, so I started the same, but as I sort of went along, it changed. So it, you know, made two different patterns on each of the two birds. So they're the same, but they have differences. This piece is called Wolf Mouth. Also about a couple years after, so 2012, 2011, 2012, I did two other residencies where I was also interested in continuing to engage with wilderness, and it really informed this next series that I'm going to talk about. So I did a residency at a place called the Brush Creek Foundation for the Arts, which is near Saratoga, Wyoming. So it's in a fairly remote area of Wyoming. And then in 2012, I had the great fortune of getting together with a group called Signal Fire. who is a group of artists in Portland who lead very non-traditional artist residencies for artists, where they take them out into the wilderness on like boat trips, backpacking trips, and so it's really about having this experience of wilderness. They do all the trips almost exclusively on public land. So this is Amy Harwood in the middle, and Linda Wysong, who are both Portland-based artists. So they do other projects on public lands to advocate for the access to and protection of the remaining wild and open places in order to enrich and sustain society. And also the groups of people that they take out are really varied and interesting. So we had, musicians from Boston and writers from New York and a really interesting group of people. And we went on this backpacking trip in Mount Hood National Forest, and this in particular was in the Bull of the Woods wilderness area. So this is, fairly close to Portland. And one of the most spectacular parts of the hike that we went on. Even though I'm smiling, I was in seriously a lot of pain. I had a knee issue that was starting to hurt really bad here, but we walked through this recently burned area that had been this extremely hot fire, and it was extremely fascinating. And so these two experiences really influenced this body of work that I worked on from 2012 to 2014. There's a couple different series here. One is called Standing Still and Moving Through the Wilderness, and then one is called Repeat and Shift. And it really was just kind of, I made about 50 of these, so it was like a really kind of long-term investigation of a lot of the ideas that I've sort of talked about up until now. And in the studio, working on paper, working in a very detailed way, but using a lot of these images that sort of come up. Some of them are about more specific ideas. So this is another image of the wolf mouth. So I've been interested in the story of the wolf, particularly, I'm sure you guys are all familiar just because of your proximity to Idaho, about what's going on in Idaho. With the wolf and my experience, in Denali, encountering wolves. I didn't say that one thing that happened in my whole residency in Denali, I did not see one wolf. And the night I was packing to leave, I was in the cabin, so here I am in Muri's little cabin, and I can feel two eyes on me, and I look out the window, and right outside of Muri's cabin is a wolf just staring at me. Staring in the window, which seemed like a really weird thing for an animal to do. It was like one of the most eerie and strange things that's ever happened to me in my life. And I was able to, I went out the front door and I, looked at the wolf. It circled the cabin several times. And it was seriously, I was almost like, Adolph Muri is like, his something about him is here. This wolf knows it. Like, it was a very, very strange experience. So I've made a series of these wolf mouth drawings. Again, kind of going back to the idea, sort of like the News from the Wilderness piece, where, only one part of the story of the wolf, is being told. And this story about the wolf is this evil, conniving, horrible creature, which is why I'm depicting it only this mouth, but it's a useless mouth because it's a taxidermy mouth. And so I've kind of gone back to using that image. So here's a detail of that. So I'll just show you this series. So these are recent. These last couple are 2013, 2014. This is a piece that I'll come back and talk about in a minute because I did another project that was really in a lot of ways inspired by this drawing. This is two blackback woodpeckers. Blackback woodpeckers are one of the species that re-inhabit a burned area first. So in that burned area where I showed you where I was hiking, that was the one bird that I saw, and they depend on fire. So they have to have fire as part of their, life course. So I was really interested in them and, thinking about, recently everything that's been happening with all the fires. This is a Townsend solitaire. And this is just a shot of, I recently had a show in Boise at a gallery called Enso Art Space of a lot of those pieces. So this is an installation shot of that. The larger drawing, I think I have, a detail of it, was also in that show. This sort of took, it was a piece that I've actually been working on. It's another really large scale piece, so just the detail in it took me quite a long time to work on it. Several years ago I read a poem by Marilyn Nelson in a book called Black Nature. It's a book of African American nature poetry that really had a profound effect on me. I mean, it's one of the only, probably the only anthology of African American nature poetry. And, African Americans have such, a complex history with the natural world in this country. And so I was interested in making this piece. My partner, Bill Lewis, who's also a painter, his family is from Alabama. So about 15 years ago when we got together, we started going to Alabama. His family's place is, in the countryside. It was my first experience being in the South. It's very close to, historically where a lot of plantations were located. It's also located very close to the highway that runs from Selma to Montgomery, right off that road. So there's this rich, but of course it's it's out in the country. It's filled with creatures, and his brother's a fish farmer. So my whole experience of being there was just being immersed in nature, but also being immersed in imagining and thinking about my own history and the history of this place. So this piece was really in response to that. It's called Promise and Purpose, The Ancestor's Dream. There's this Marilyn Nelson poem that's about George Washington Carver. It's about my own personal relationship to nature as a biracial person, and also about the complexities of Black people's relationship to nature, particularly in the South. So it's about hope and connection, and also about the devastating and horrible history, and ultimately about the images and ideas that can come from both of these things. There is a specific reference, the plant, which is kind of obscured, but I wanted to show a detail. But those weird kind of bulbous forms are images of sweet potatoes. So George Washington Carver, everybody kind of knows him as the Peanut Man. He made a computer from a peanut. That's kind of the joke. But the fact that it's kind of a joke, I thought was sort of interesting, because to me, George Washington Carver is this historical figure of amazing importance, because he, an African American, a professor, really just one generation removed from slavery. But he, especially I think a lot of what people are thinking about right now in contemporary culture in relationship to wanting to make your own food and know, where your food comes from, where, how you sort of think about the natural world, all these things that he was super invested in. I mean, basically he, studied the peanut and studied the peanut too, which was kind of what the poem is about, is not native to the southern United States, and it probably came from Africa, and it probably came from slaves who came to the southern, were brought to the southern United States. So here is this thing that, you know, came from this most tragic experience, but he taught people like how it could nourish them. So from the sweet potato, from the peanut. So that was kind of the basis for the piece, and then the bird and the snake idea came from like stories that I would hear from different family members, but also from different people who were living in this area and their like personal relationship to the natural world. So it was an interesting piece to make, and I'm really kind of continuing on this particular track in my newest work that I'm doing right now. This piece was also in the show. This is a piece called OR7, and it's about OR7, who's that Oregon wolf that went on the 1,200-mile walkabout while being tracked by Oregon Fish and Game, and then found a mate and had his den about 60 miles north of the California border. So likely his babies will be the first known wolves in California since like the 1920s, so basically like 100 years. This is another just series of pieces that were in that show, kind of related to some of the things that I've already talked about. And then I think just one more project I'm going to talk about before I end. So last summer I was invited by the city of Boise, has a space downtown. It was only really to be open last year. It's called the Sesqui Shop because last year was the sesquicentennial of the city of Boise. But it was so successful that they've kept it open as a gallery space now. So each month they would have a different theme, and one of the months they decided they wanted an environmental theme, and then they wanted to invite an artist to do a residency, make work in this public space, and people could come in and interact, and then have a show at the end when the work was done. So they invited me to come and do this project, really on like very short notice, and they said, you know, environmental art in the space for a month, go, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I don't know. And I came up with the idea on very short notice to make a project about trees, because Boise is known as the city of trees. So it's sort of this oasis of trees in the desert. So this is me at the beginning of the project. I mean, really, I had like just kind of like a week's notice, and then I'm in the space and I'm starting to make the work. So the first thing I did is I walked along the river and I made just rubbings of trees that had been cut down to sort of get me thinking about the process. Trees, of course, being the largest and longest living organisms that we encounter in our daily lives, can also, I think, be rendered invisible when they're taken for granted in the urban landscape. They live outside this culture of immediacy that we have. Because a lot of them live, you know, just a lot of the trees that you see in like the city live, you know, 150 years or sometimes more. I had the great opportunity right when I started this project of coming across W.S. Merwin's prose poem called Unchopping a Tree, which really became the basis for this entire project. So, getting a little short on time, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically, prose poem that's really giving directions of how to put back together a tree that's been chopped down. And of course, that's impossible. But in this essay, of course, he's talking about it in a lot of detail as really, you know, instructional, but of course, every instruction he gives is something that could never be done. So it becomes this metaphor for like what we've done to the natural world. We can't undo it. Like there's no way to unchop a tree. And this essay, if you get a chance to read it, it's like devastating. I mean, I think I like cried. And he's a great writer. He's a great poet. I was just devastated. So I really took it as like the foundation for the entire project. So the first thing I started working on, and you could see it, that big log sitting in front of me at the table. The first thing I did is I got a big chunk of tree and just started making relief prints. And the relief prints were really about saying something about the tree and how it lived. So absence and presence. So the growth via the tree rings, and also the destruction of the tree via the cut marks from the saw. And you could see both of those here. And then after I made the prints, I was doing all these hand-drawn elements around it as a way of, bringing back together something about the tree. Really, sort of metaphorically putting it back together. So this is another one of those pieces. And then also, since I was working with the city, I was lucky enough that they put me in touch with the Boise City Forestry Department, who very generously let me start collecting tree limbs and trees that they were cutting down, so they maintain all the trees like in the parks and everything. So I started making a number of pieces where I was metaphorically putting back together the tree and creating these new forms that were related to the tree. So this one was called Rings. So this is, several hundred 8-inch pieces of cut branches that were collected throughout the city of Boise. And here's a detail. This was just a large tree trunk that I cut and then put back together. So I made a new support for it, a steel support that held it, vertical again, like a tree. I'm really sorry about, I'm not sure why this keeps doing this very quickly. This is another piece where smaller branches cut into much smaller sections, and then they were drilled, so they were strung together. Just unchopping the tree by sort of stringing together with linen bookbinding thread, and then those are little felt discs in between. So the felt again became this like healing element to like put the branches back together. And then this is all the sawdust that was made for one of my cutting of these big pieces that I'm going to show in a minute. And here just presented as this, pile on a felt-covered flint, and then there's a silver branch on the top. So these were, pieces where I was more metaphorically taking this idea of unchopping a tree. So these were cut large sections of big logs, and then I was doing a lot of stitching. One of the great things about the Merwin essays, talking about like how you'd have to put together not only the tree, but all the spider webs and nests and things that are inside of the tree. And of course, he says like, you don't have the tools that the spider has, so how would you ever do this? So I was doing a lot of like sewing and stringing and things that ultimately probably would not be effective, but have this sort of visual sense. So this is the opening. And then I was able to build onto and take one of the pieces to an outdoor location. This is at the Boise Watershed Environmental Education Center. And this is a long-term, temporary outdoor piece now that's out at the watershed. So there it is, what it looks like with snow on it. I like this picture because you could see that a little animal had visited and skirted right around the edge, like he had respected it. And then this is what I installed it last September, so it's like a year old now, and this is what it looked like in the spring. It actually held water, so it was on a very, very dry space, but it actually worked as like a mulch. So in the spring, even though the area all around it was totally desolate, the piece itself was like alive with all these plants and flowers and things. I'm just going to say this is a public art piece in the city of Boise. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to skip over that. And this was the last piece to tell me to take a breath because the talk is over. And thank you very much. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yeah.
So I have a few questions. I actually seen that your piece, the public art piece, is in Boise like 2 times.
Yeah, so it's a larger project going on throughout the city. There's these traffic boxes that control the traffic lights, so they're having artists do original artworks and then transfers and things like that. So, yeah, mine is called Boise Urban Wildlife, and it's taken from like, you know, because Boise is we're on a river, and just with our proximity to the foothills, which I'm sure it's the same thing here. Like we've had mountain lions and coyotes regularly show up, like in the downtown core, like where that piece is. So that was kind of what I made the piece about. Any other questions? Yeah.
How long do your art series typically take you to finish? Or are you under like some sort of time limit, or?
Sometimes I am, and that usually is very inspiring to get things done, like if it was a show. It really depends. I mean, sometimes I just do something and I do the series like all in one weekend, and then sometimes I just continue things over a length of time, like that. The Works on Paper series, like, you know, I really worked on over really almost 3 years, because I just worked on, you know, such a large number. Usually don't work in series that large because I sort of work through something and then I'm kind of on to the next thing. But I do tend to work in series, you know, trying to convey an idea through a grouping of things rather than one individual thing, because it's just an easier way for me to tell a story or talk about a concept that's, you know, has multiple sort of aspects to it. So I like to work that way. Yeah.
How do you get those residencies? Do you apply to those, or?
Yeah, they're all things that I've applied for. Residencies are, you know, it's a competitive thing, so you're generally applying along with another group of artists depending on the residency. Like they can be really competitive or not. But generally, yeah, you submit like a body of images of slides of your work, photographs of your work, some sort of written documentation of your work, and then you wait and see. The funny thing about the Denali, like they get a lot of applications. Like I think, you know, it's wavered between like 300 and 500 a year for like 2-3 spots, which isn't like, I mean, there's some that get like 2,000 applications for 20 spots, so it's not the highest, but it is a lot. And I actually got a rejection email from Denali. They were like, sorry, you didn't get it. And I was like, oh, okay, whatever, better luck next time. And then like a week later, so I must have been like number 4 out of 3, and number 3 couldn't make it. So they called me a week later and said, we would like to invite you to come to Denali. And I was like, oh, you just told me I couldn't. And they're like, now we're telling you you can. So sometimes weird things like that happen. But yeah, it's a competitive process. And there's a lot of different kinds of residencies. So like the one that was mentioned in the introduction, and a few that I've been to, you know, they're much more posh than being in a one-room cabin with no electricity. I mean, that was an incredible experience. But other residencies where you go and they give you a living space and they give you a really nice studio, those are really nice too. And I've been to places like that, and it's a good place to go and make a whole bunch of work. I think it's a really great thing to do, like right after you finish your degree, whether it's a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, because it gives you time to just totally be with yourself and your work and nothing else, which is one, you know, that's an experience that, you know, up until the first time I went to a residency, I'd never had, to just not focus on anything else except for my work, which is really great and nice, you know, after you've been in an educational experience where you've had a lot of, you know, input and great, you know, exposure to a lot of things, to just go and think about things for a while. And do things without interruption. It's fantastic. Yeah.
You all combine different needs and what you're working on. I've got 2 questions. Can you talk about how multimedia works in the work, and how the use of color works, and why you select the colors and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I really just select the media to go along with conceptually what I'm doing. Which is why in a lot of ways, like, even though I'm thinking about what I'm doing, I forgot to say that, like, you know, even those tree pieces, I thought about in a lot of ways like drawing. I guess I sort of alluded to that. But even though I'm using this different material, this is a lot of the project that I was doing. So really, you know, it starts with conceptually what I'm doing and what material is going to fit. Which is why, in some cases, like painting as a medium, it has like this, intricate and complicated and heavy history that you really have to deal with every time you paint something. Like the way that you paint it, it's like making all these references to all these other things. So sometimes you want that, like sometimes when I'm referencing like an earlier period of painting, but sometimes you don't want that, and so you have to think about, well, what other medias can I use to help me ultimately convey the idea. So yeah, interesting color, or sort of maybe lack of color. I sort of go in between one or the other. I think the sort of lack of color and those like palettes with just like the black and white and gray was really inspired by the Denali experience, and I sort of talked about that experience of light. And I think sometimes color, kind of like painting, also has this kind of seductive quality, and so you're in a way you're kind of like forcing the viewer to look at something for a different reason than just like the surface of the paint or the color. So sometimes having a sort of limited palette can be an interesting strategy that I like to. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
And Grizzly Bear, you have very strong particular colors.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that piece, I think the use of color and that was referring to that, different from the other pieces. The idea was coming from this media environment. I wasn't painting the bear as it existed in Denali. I was painting the bear how it existed on the news report. So I think I was purposely kind of using this kind of loud, color around it to kind of tell that story in an abstract way. Yeah.
You use a lot of different medium. Do you have a preferred medium to work in?
I think I always come back to drawing, but I don't know. Whatever sort of lends itself, I think, to what I'm doing, I'll take it on. I'll take it on. And I did fabricate everything, that I showed, with one exception. That steel backbone that I made for that vertical tree piece. That piece is like 9 feet tall. I'm not a steel fabricator, so I designed it, and then I got a little help with the welding and steel fabrication. But yeah, I like to experiment with a lot of different media, and whatever sort of suits what I'm working on, I'll try it. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.